All right. Thanks everyone for being here. And from the Office of the Minnesota Secretary of State, we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us this evening. My name is Peter Bartz Gallagher. I'm Communications Director here at the office, and I want to welcome you to our first Elections Town Hall. Now, everyone is here tonight because you care about our democracy and how to defend it and how to sustain it. We are so glad to have two outstanding voices with us tonight, your Minnesota Secretary of State, Steve Simon, and from the Center for Election Innovation and Research, David Becker. Steve Simon is Minnesota's 22nd Secretary of State. He was sworn into office on January 5th, 2015, and as Minnesota's Chief Election Administrator, pledged in his inaugural address to work with anyone of any political affiliation from any part of the state to protect, defend, and strengthen the right to vote in Minnesota. As Secretary of State, he partners with township, city, and county officials to organize elections on behalf of Minnesota's nearly 4 million eligible voters and to ensure that the election system is fair. He's an active member of the National Association of Secretaries of State and served as president of that organization from 2024 to 2025. Before being elected Secretary of State, he served in the Minnesota House of Representatives for 10 years, representing communities of St. Louis Park and Hopkins. He spent much of his time in the legislature immersed in election issues, including serving as the chair of the House Elections Committee in 2013 and 2014. David Becker, with us tonight, is the executive director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research, working with election officials of both parties all around the country to ensure elections that voters should trust and do trust. Prior to founding CEIR, David was director of the elections program at the Pew Charitable Trusts, and before that served for 7 years as senior trial attorney in the voting section of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, overseeing voting rights enforcement in several states, including California and Georgia. He is the co-author with CBS News chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett of the book, The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. Tonight, we'll hear from each speaker about what they see on the road ahead in this important election year, and we'll be glad to answer any questions you might have. As we go along, you can type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, and we'll address them. A bit of housekeeping first. Our planned ASL interpreter has been unable to join us due to emergency, so apologies that there's no ASL interpretation tonight. We do have CART services for captioning available. You can click show captions if you need. We will be recording this session, as you heard the recording begin, and we'll post to YouTube in case you want to share it with someone else or just watch it again later. And of course, if you're interested in getting involved, please reach out to our office, join our mailing list, get ready for the big elections year ahead, and you can partner with our voter outreach team and receive communications from our office about what we have going on. So with that, thank you so very much, and please welcome Secretary Steve Simon.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm Steve Simon, Minnesota Secretary of State, and I know you'll hear from David Becker in a minute, and you're in for a treat because he's an extraordinary national resource and treasure when it comes to matters of voting and elections and democracy. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. We are 187 days away from the November general election. We count those things in our office. There are a lot of people watching that clock, and it's going to go very, very quickly. Maybe you've heard me say before that we in our office like to think of ourselves as being in the democracy business. And it is quite a time to be in the democracy business right now. It's not just our office, it's other like offices across the country. And within Minnesota, we have a lot of partners and teammates. As many of you know, there are different roles to play for different layers and levels of government. So we work routinely with cities and counties and townships across Minnesota. So for example, we in our office don't count votes. We never lay a finger on someone's ballot on election day. That all happens at the local level in literally thousands of places all over the state of Minnesota. We don't hire or train or pay the poll workers, who we of course call election judges in Minnesota. That too is a local function. But we do a lot of other things in our office. We do everything from certifying the elections equipment for use in the polling place, to overseeing the certification of the statewide elections, to overseeing post-election audits and reviews. We do a lot of work at the legislature, like now when the legislature is in session, to tweak and change and perfect our election laws. And we regularly talk with our partners in counties, cities, and townships about legal issues, about policy issues, and the like. And we do nonpartisan voter outreach efforts. So that's why we say we are in the democracy business. My goal over the next 187 days is pretty simple. I'm looking to see two things at the end of that road of 187 days. And I could say the same last election and the election before, but I just want to repeat it. My twin goals are I want to see high turnout and low drama. Those two things, high turnout and low drama. And in Minnesota, we have a very good record of having achieved each time and time and time again. And you may know that in Minnesota, we have for a long time enjoyed very high turnout. In fact, we've been the national champion more times than not over the last 50 years or so. Again, this goes back decades. This isn't just about my time in office. Going back to the 1970s, Minnesota has always enjoyed sky high levels of voting across zip codes, across county lines, across political affiliations. And while not every community in Minnesota votes at sky high levels, we consistently outperform the rest of the country. And I think it's a safe bet based not only on our past history, but based on all the continuing efforts that we're going to have high turnout again this year. I'm not here to get into armchair sort of political analysis or anything of the kind, except to say that people seem motivated, people seem excited, people seem interested. And in Minnesota, voting really, really matters. And it matters for a couple of reasons. And it's been supported for a couple of reasons. One is good laws. And the other one is we've had a really good pro-voter culture in Minnesota. Good laws, I won't give you a long laundry list, but both on access and security, which you need in your laws, both evenly and equally. On access and security, Minnesota has some excellent laws that have stood the test of time. Things like same day or election day voter registration, which we've had for over 50 years. Things like the ability to register online. Things like the ability to vote from home if you want to. Those are examples of access. And on the security side, Minnesota has enjoyed security features that few other states have. For example, when someone votes from home by mail, they have to provide two forms of personal identifying information, either a driver's license number or state ID number, and or a partial social security number. The voter has to sign an attestation saying that they're the one who voted the ballot. And then there's a witness requirement as well. So those triple layers of security have really served us well and made for a very secure system when it comes to voting by mail, an increasingly popular option in Minnesota. So the laws have really contributed, I think, to our success, as has overall a positive culture when it comes to voting. And when I say culture, I'm not talking about the culture wars in our politics. When I talk about the word culture, I mean a habit or a way of doing things. What is our habit? What is our way of doing things in Minnesota? And I think our habit and way of doing things is to value voting. It starts in our schools. I think our business and nonprofit communities do a good job of alerting people to elections and their importance. And I think media coverage in this state, whether you like the particular point of view or not, news media sources of all kinds and all viewpoints cover elections, give them focus, give them attention. So that has put us in a really good place in terms of turnout. But what about the low drama part? I said that I had two goals, high turnout and low drama. That one is trickier to assess. Now, I didn't say no drama. I said low drama. There's always going to be some drama. But in terms of ensuring low drama, a minimum of bad drama, there are a number of things that I wanted to talk about this evening. I want to say a little bit about what I see coming potentially in the next 187 days, things that give me pause and the things that we're preparing for. And just to zoom out a little bit, you know, when we work with our partners and our teammates, not only across state lines, but especially within Minnesota, the counties, the cities, the townships, we have an all hazards approach when it comes to planning for election. Meaning, just like anyone in any job, yours or mine, we hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And when we plan for the worst, we're often planning for things that may never materialize. In fact, it may be a real minimal chance that that thing materializes, 1% or less. So we have to plan for the weather event. We have to plan for the gas leak. We have to plan with our partners for the power outage and so forth. But what I want to talk about a little bit tonight is the planning that we're doing, unfortunately, for the prospect, the possibility that there might be some sort of interference, direct or indirect, from the federal government from Washington, D.C. Again, it's not a prediction on my part. In fact, I hope that it's a remote possibility, but it is a precaution that we are taking. And there's some things in particular that I want to alert you to that we're at least thinking about, that we're gaming out, and that we're planning. So when I look at what's going on nationally, and I know that Mr. Becker is going to talk about this a little bit, there have been a number of proposals in Congress, which, if passed, particularly under the present circumstances, could adversely impact people's freedom to vote in Minnesota. One of the things that maybe you've been paying attention to is something called the SAVE Act or Save America Act, which has been making its way through Congress. It's passed the House in a number of different forms and now is I think it's fair to say, sort of bottled up in the Senate right now. And the headline of the SAVE Act or Save America Act, the sort of headline item, is a documentary proof of citizenship requirement. Documentary, meaning papers. You'll have to show papers to demonstrate and prove that you're a U.S. citizen. And let me just say right there, I completely understand why anyone in this call or anyone anywhere in America hearing that and only that might think that that's, a very reasonable common sense idea. That you should have to, for something as important as citizenship, demonstrate proof. But I think what I think is not said enough is how this would play out in the real world. So, for example, we have 69 million women in America who have a different last name now than the one they were born with. That's not a problem if someone has, for example, a passport. But tens of millions in that category do not have a passport. So what would they have to do? What they would likely have to do is produce both a birth certificate and a marriage record. And that's one for each marriage. If they were married more than once, it would be more than one marriage record. And I would even concede that many people will be able to come up with those two things. They have them or they know where to get them, and it would be simple and easy. I think that's right. But we know from experience in other states that many people won't be able to come up with those things. And in the state of Kansas, between 10 and 15 years ago, they experimented with exactly this approach. They passed what I guess you could call as a mini version of the SAVE Act. And before that was tossed out by a federal judge, they actually held an election under that statute, under that law. And when they did, 31,000 eligible Kansans, eligible, like me, like many of you, born, raised, etc., were fenced out and unable to vote because they couldn't meet those requirements. Minnesota is roughly double the size of Kansas. So that's something that worries me and that I think needs to be talked about more. And I think accounts for the main reason that it seems to be stalled or stuck or bottled up right now in the U.S. Senate. I'm also concerned that it would impose criminal penalties for elections administrators, criminal penalties who get it wrong. It would also take effect immediately upon enactment. That's really not normal for any large piece of legislation. If you look over the sweep of the last few decades when Congress has enacted voting legislation, there's been some reasonable runway that enables states and counties and cities and all who administer it to build the infrastructure necessary to do that. So it's just a cautionary tale. It looks as if it's less likely to happen than to happen at this point, but I did want to mention it as something that we're thinking through. Obviously, as with any law, if it passes, we will dutifully enforce it as we must. We don't get to choose, nor should we, which laws we like or don't like to enforce. But I do just want to sound a note of caution about what on the surface may sound to a lot of folks very reasonable, could have some real implementation problems and interfere with people's freedom to vote. So there's that in terms of laws. And we've also seen in the federal government some executive orders over the last couple of years, year and a half or so, that have been issued by the White House. Last year, the White House issued an executive order that purported to do what the SAVE Act wants to do, which is impose by executive order a documentary proof of citizenship requirement. And then more recently, within the last month, the president has issued an executive order on voting by mail, which would empower or really require the U.S. Postal Service to play a gatekeeper or sort of a traffic cop role in determining eligibility and not deliver ballots that it somehow determined were voted by ineligible persons. They've never been put in that situation. I don't know how they would do it, but leaving on the shelf just for a minute, just for a second, whether you think those are good ideas or bad ideas. What Minnesota and a number of states have had success in showing in court is it's just not something that the Constitution allows. I'm not talking about the policy, but the procedure. Article 1, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution is pretty clear. It's the Elections Clause. It says that states are in charge of the time, place, and manner of elections, except Congress can step in and pass a law and step into some of those state-led spaces. But the Constitution doesn't say anything about a president, this one or any president, just sort of waving a magic wand and decreeing things about the election system. So last year, Minnesota was among the states that went to court to block that executive order as to the citizenship piece, and we were successful. We have joined an even larger group of states this time in court to invalidate this executive order. Again, not on the grounds that it's right or wrong, good or bad, but just that the president doesn't have the authority to do this. The place, the manner in which this should be done is to pass an actual law through Congress. So that's coming up as well. The other thing that I'm concerned about when it comes to the federal government is actually not the presence of something, but the absence of something. We have, for the better part of the decade, we, the states, not just Minnesota, but all states, have come to rely on and count on some really useful and helpful assistance from the federal government when it comes to election security, be it cybersecurity, physical security, and assessing possible threats to our election system, whether it's hackers or influencers acting through mis and disinformation, et cetera. And this has been a consistent thing we've relied on through Democratic and Republican administrations. In fact, during the first Trump administration, I want to give credit where it's due. They were excellent partners, excellent. And not just the career folks, political appointees too, really trustworthy and really good partners. Unfortunately, over the last year and a half or so, we've seen, at least what I perceive, as a backing away or a retreat from a good part of that mission. So some of the things we've come to rely on in the past, like intelligence briefings, things like penetration testing, which is a fancy title for hiring or asking someone to come and hack you, a good guy hacking to try to find vulnerabilities. Things like helping us with tabletop exercises with our partners here within Minnesota. Those things have not been forthcoming. And with 187 days left, it seems as if they won't be. But I just want to soothe anyone who thinks that's leaving a gaping hole that won't be filled. It is being filled. So though we perceive a lack of the robust partnership that we've had in the past with the federal government, we are making every effort successfully right now to fill those gaps, fill those holes, get those services so that we're able to have the security and the monitoring and the oversight that Minnesotans have come to expect. So I feel really good about that. It's just unfortunate that there's been, again, what I perceive as a retreat from that mission as well. And maybe that's a good place for me to talk about the resilience of our system. I'm an optimist about the democracy business in America and in Minnesota. Sure, we face now some challenges and even threats to the administration of a smooth election, but I think we're going to be able to meet those challenges and overcome those threats. You know, Minnesota's system in particular is very resilient. We've got really good laws in Minnesota that, as I say, balance access and security. We have definitely have the partnerships in Minnesota. We definitely have the resolve in Minnesota. And so I think we're going to be able to overcome those things, whether it's in the courtroom, whether it's through the great work of our partners at every layer of and level of government in Minnesota. We do have that resilience. And remember, we are a bottom-up system. We're not a top-down system. You know, last fall in the 2025 municipal and local election, we ran a public service campaign talking about Minnesota elections locally crafted. And that's exactly right. They are. The hard work, the frontline work happens in a very decentralized way across the entire state of Minnesota. And those good laws and that good culture really show up in those frontline events and that frontline election administration that thousands and thousands of people across Minnesota help out with on and up to and leading up to election day. So what I would say is this, I suspect that many people on this call are maybe a bit anxious about the upcoming election and are worried about particular challenges and particular threats. But the call to action that I would give out tonight is this. It's to stay for now in the information space. What is not as needed right now is sort of a mass mobilization of people to show up to polling places and the like. Yes, I get asked all the time about what if there's ICE at the polling place or Border Patrol at the polling place. But for now, I think the best use of people's time and energy is to engage in the information space. Whatever community, clientele, customers, group you represent or are associated with on this call, if any, tell them what the rules are. Tell them what the law is. If someone's afraid of an interaction at the polling place, for example, remind them of their option to vote from home. No one has to run the gauntlet of anyone or anything at a polling place in Minnesota. You don't have to go to a physical place if you don't want to. We have the laws on the books that ensure anyone access to the ballot by mail if they want. That's just one of many examples. But the more we can fill the space with the truth and what the system is, the better we will enable people to turn away from the things that we know are false, that are mis, dis, and malinformation. So my call to action to everyone is get involved in that information space. One good way to start is our website, which is mnvotes.gov. That's MN, like Minnesota, votes.gov. mnvotes.gov is where you can go to find out all the rules. You can go to find out where your polling place is, how physically to vote, how to register to vote. You can register online. You can get materials in non-English languages. You can find out who or what is on your ballot later this year once the nominees and the candidates are known. It's a great one-stop shop, so I encourage it. I'll have more to say during the questions and answers, but I just wanted to give you my assessment and my view from here with 187 days to go. Peter, I'll turn it back to you so that you can turn it over to Mr. Becker.
Thanks so much, Secretary Simon. And yes, keep putting those questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them in a little while. Now to turn to Mr. Becker. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and Steve and Peter and the whole staff in the Secretary's office. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on this. It's an incredible honor to be on the first one of these town halls. I imagine almost everyone watching is a Minnesota voter, and all I can say is you are very fortunate to live in Minnesota, to be served by the public servants in the state of Minnesota who make your voting experience so easy and convenient and secure. And no one typifies that more than Secretary Simon, who, quite frankly, is not just a leader in terms of election policy and a thought leader with regard to democracy in the state of Minnesota, but I can tell you nationwide, there are people on both sides of the aisle who come to Secretary Simon for all kinds of things. So it's a real honor to be speaking with you all today. And I think Secretary Simon mentioned this. As I travel the country and I talk to election officials and voters all over the country, I do get a sense of uneasiness about where we are right now. I get a lot of questions about all of the things that seem to be snowballing into, a feeling of concern and even despair or fear about what the current state of our democracy is. I can understand that. I mean, just yesterday, was it already yesterday? The Supreme Court basically eviscerates the Voting Rights Act, which I spent many years enforcing, and I believe so firmly was the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. Now it's effectively, unfortunately, dead. We see states doing mid-decade redistrictings and in some cases re-redistrictings to try to uh, eke out some kind of partisan benefit. As Secretary Simon mentioned, there are partisans in Congress who are trying to push the Save America Act legislation that would dictate to states how they run their elections in ways that we haven't seen before. We have seen executive orders from the President of the United States, again with the swipe of a Sharpie pen, seeking to dictate to states how they run elections. We've seen the Department of Justice try to seize sensitive voter data from states, including from Minnesota, basically from every state. Data that includes very sensitive information, name, birth date, social security number, driver's license number. And we've seen investigations of past elections with warrants served in places like Fulton County and subpoenas served in places like Maricopa County. We even have to deal with this idea, this concern that the president of the United States might order troops or ICE to be at polling places in the election. But like Secretary Simon, I'm an optimist. And I'm looking at all of these things. And what I will tell you is that while the bluster increases, the substance is decreasing. I am seeing the threats actually decrease over time. And that is thanks to people like Secretary Simon and his staff, thanks to the local and county election officials all throughout the state of Minnesota and across the country. It is thanks to, quite frankly, the courts. Whatever one thinks of the Supreme Court, the courts have really stood up for voters and for election policy and for the Constitution in this. And I want to talk a little bit about how each of these things really is evidence not so much of the strength of the federal government in terms of dictating policy to the states or potentially interfering with elections. But in many ways, they demonstrate the weakness against the public service of our election officials in states like Minnesota and across the entire country. If you look at the redistrictings, for instance, these redistrictings are happening in some places. I will tell you the Calais decision, I don't expect to have any impact on Minnesota whatsoever, certainly not for 2026. I don't think, and for the foreseeable future. And in those states that choose to redistrict to minimize or eliminate the minority voting rights that have been achieved over the last 61 years, they may do that. But what they're going to do when they redistrict is they are going to be making their state more vulnerable to a wave election. The way partisan gerrymanders work, the way a partisan majority creates more districts for their party, is they have to shave the margins down in those districts. And that makes those districts vulnerable to a wave election. So watch very closely. I will tell you this right now. I'm not making any predictions like Secretary Simon said. I'm first of all really bad at a lot of those predictions. But what I will tell you is I expect high turnout. And I expect that high turnout to alter the expectations of those who are drawing the lines, the partisans who are drawing the lines. When they draw the lines, they are basically drawing those lines based on past performance in elections, based on past turnout. Midterm turnout nationally averages about 42 to 46%. Over half of eligible voters don't vote in a midterm election. The highest turnout we've ever seen in a midterm election in modern American history is 50% in 2018, the midterm election during President Trump's first term. Imagine if those lines are drawn to an expectation of 44, 45%, and we get 54 or 55%. It drives every expectation out the window. So let these states do that to themselves. It's unfortunate that minority voters no longer have the protections that we fought so hard for over the last century. But I expect that politically the outcomes are going to be different than many people expect. With regard to the SAVE Act, let me just tell you this because I've seen some questions already come through. I will say this probably because Secretary Simon's going to be much more cautious about these things, understandably. But I work with members of Congress. I talk to members of Congress of both sides all the time. It is not going to pass. It's just not going to pass. There's no mechanism to get it to pass. Senate leadership and the Republican side is unwilling to eliminate the filibuster, and understandably so, because it's possible that they don't even have 50 votes in the Senate for this bill. If you talk privately to members of the Senate in particular, including Republican members, they know it's a bad bill. By the way, they're not even sure it won't hurt Republicans more. There's significant evidence that Republicans could be harmed more by the SAVE Act than Democrats would be. And so they're somewhat relieved that there's no real mechanism to turn this into law. To put this in a really bipartisan sense, Democrats tried to pass a massive overhaul of elections back in 2021 and 2022, and they failed. They didn't get to 50 votes either in the Senate. And both these bills, while different substantively, and you can have different opinions about them, and there were parts of those bills that you might like or not like, both those bills, one proposed by the Democrats, one proposed by the Republicans, shared certain characteristics. And those characteristics were the minority was united in opposition to them, and the majority was not united in support of them. And so these bills are not going to pass. And that's good because the best bills that come through Congress are bills that come through in a bipartisan sense, like the Help America Vote Act, like the Voting Rights Act. We just mentioned the recent Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court, where 6 people on the Supreme Court replaced the judgment of Congress with their own. That judgment of Congress was passed in 2006 in the last renewal of the Voting Rights Act, 98-0 in the Senate and 390-33 in the House. Congress acts best when it's bipartisan and when it's informed by the election officials. So the SAVE Act, I wouldn't worry about it at all. It's not going to pass. It's not going to be the law. With regard to the executive orders, my message is the same. The first executive order, as Secretary Simon mentioned, was challenged by a bunch of states, including Minnesota. It was blocked by 3 different federal courts, but for all intents and purposes, it's entirely blocked. It is entirely dead. Just a few weeks ago, on March 31st, the president signed another executive order. That executive order sought to put extreme restrictions on mail voting in the states, restrictions that flew in the face of the laws that those states had passed. It sought to dictate to the Department of Homeland Security that they were going to create, for the first time in American history, a national citizen/voter list. and that it was sought to dictate to the Postal Service that it was going to demand the list of voters who chose to vote by mail from the states and compare it to that magic DHS list. And if someone wasn't on the DHS list, Postal Service is not to deliver a mail ballot to them. Within 3 days of that executive order being signed, 5 different federal court cases were filed in 2 different federal courts, DC and Massachusetts. There were preliminary injunction motions pending in both. In DC, that preliminary injunction motion is being heard on May 14th, and Massachusetts is being heard on June 2nd. I will tell you with near absolute certainty, courts are going to block these executive orders. There's no question. Secretary Simon mentioned the thing that I always like to bring up at the beginning of my talks. Article 1, Section 4, the Elections Clause of the Constitution. There are places in the Constitution where there are ambiguities and there's vagueness and gray areas. Elections is not one of them. The framers were incredibly wise, and when they established our nation and created the Constitution, they had just fought a war against a monarchy. And if you read one thread throughout the entire Constitution, it is the limit on executive power. And they specifically carved out elections to be clear about those limits, giving power over elections first to the state legislatures. Congress can have some power. The executive, the president, has zero power. If the president wants to establish election policy in the states, he has one avenue and one avenue only, and that is to persuade Congress to pass a law. And he has failed to do so. Those executive orders will be blocked. I wouldn't worry about them one bit. Whether you're a voter or an election official, you're not going to have to enforce them. We talked a little bit about the DOJ efforts to seize sensitive voter data. Minnesota is challenging that. 30 states plus DC are challenging that. 5 of the last 6 states sued were Republican-led states. This is a bipartisan effort to protect and secure voter data that is protected by state laws in those states. Only about a dozen states have just relinquish that data without any protections to the federal government. I think they're going to really regret it because as we've gone through those cases, and if memory serves, Minnesota is not resolved yet. It's probably on the pathway to there. But to date, we have had 6 courts rule on these lawsuits, and the DOJ is perfect. They're 0-6. It is remarkable. The DOJ's voting section has lost 6 cases in a matter of just a handful of months. I worked there for 7 years. I don't know that we lost. I know for a fact we didn't lose 6 cases in 7 years. I'm not so sure we lost 2 cases in 7 years. So this DOJ is bringing bad cases with lawyers who are ill-equipped to handle them. I think we're going to keep seeing cases roll up where the states' efforts to protect their voters, to protect their voters' sensitive data, to manage their own voter lists, which Minnesota does remarkably well, as do so many other states. Minnesota uses all the tools available to it with online voter registration, membership in the Electronic Registration Information Center, same-day registration. All of these tools help Minnesota, and many other states have these tools as well, keep their voter lists up to date as people move. And that's really important. And what federal courts are saying every single time, the last case was in Arizona just earlier this week, I think 2 days ago, by a Trump-appointed judge ruling that the DOJ had no authority to receive this data. And then the couple of the last things. First, I know the Fulton County warrant troubled a lot of people. It troubled me. Still don't know how a magistrate could have signed off on that warrant. In fact, it's being challenged. And just today, that federal court judge, a Trump appointee, told the DOJ it needs to explain a lot more about how that warrant came to pass. That is very good news. The DOJ is being held to account. But even with that first warrant, which enabled the federal government to seize information about the 2020 election for Fulton County, again, that was over 3 months ago. We still haven't heard anything. They haven't found anything. There's nothing to be found. Those ballots have been counted 3 times, 3 different ways. But think about what's happened since then. First, the warrant about 3 months ago. About a month and a half ago, there was a grand jury subpoena that was served on the Arizona Senate president, an ally of President Trump, who held documents related to the Cyber Ninjas so-called audit in 2021 that he wanted to give to the DOJ. That was served on them, but it was not served on any election office. And most recently, the DOJ sent a letter to Wayne County, Michigan, where Detroit is, asking them for information about their 2024 election. So think about the evolution here. We start with a warrant, which is the strongest form of investigation. And then there's a step down to a subpoena. You know, they would have liked a warrant there, but they didn't get it. And now we're at a strongly worded letter, which state officials, Secretary Simon's colleague, Secretary Benson in Michigan, and the Attorney General Nessel, quickly told the DOJ, no, you're not getting this information. You have no legal basis for this. The DOJ is running out of tools. They're running out of tools in their toolbox. They're not going to be able to do much. And I think there's somewhat of a recognition of that. And that gets me to the last point, and this is a point I hear from a lot of folks. What's the prospect of ICE and troops being at the polls? And I will tell you, and I can't say this more forcefully, it's not going to happen. It is not going to happen. And I direct you all to 18 USC 592, which has been on the books since the 1940s. And it makes it a federal crime punishable by a prison term of up to 5 years for anyone to order or for any troops to be present in any voting location. It's not just troops. It's, quote, armed men, unquote. That's the language of the statute. That would include ICE. If they try this, and we already know that they can't surge beyond a single metropolitan area at a time right now, even though I know the citizens of Minnesota have been through a lot with regard to ICE and federal interference. But they can't be in all of our 100,000, 200,000 polling places and blocking voting. If they do show up, and I think the chances of this are about as close to zero as possible, there's not a federal court in the nation that won't block that immediately. And it's very possible, and I think the White House knows this, there could be a pretty huge political backlash to that by the voters. So I will tell you, do not worry about that. And I think Secretary Simon raised a really big point. I know a lot of people who've expressed concern about how far the federal government can go. And one of the solutions into this, and one of the great innovations that Minnesota has been a part of, is convenience voting. That voting is so easy in Minnesota and nationwide. If you want to vote by mail, if you want to get a ballot at home and cast that ballot, you can do that. If you want to go vote early in person, you can do that. You can do that in 47 states. It's the way I personally vote. I highly encourage people to vote early in person. One of the things that I've seen nationwide is, first of all, I like to see the poll workers. I like to see how the polling place is set up. I like to thank them. It is a community event. We forget elections are celebrations, and we should take part in that celebration. We should experience the joy of being with our community, even with people we politically disagree with, and expressing our voice. It's what makes America great and why we're still around 250 years after our founding. So early in-person voting is a wonderful way of voting. And I'll tell you one other thing, one of the other reasons I like early in-person voting so much. There's a lot of concern and a lot of disinformation that swirls around the period of time after the polls close and we start seeing results reported. We often see candidates who think they're going to lose start to raise doubts about ballots as they're reported in over time, which is entirely normal and has always happened. Early in-person ballots in most states, and Secretary Simon, you might be able to tell me if this is the case in Minnesota, but I suspect it is, they're among the very first to report it out on election night because they're ready for tabulation as soon as the polls close and for rapid reporting. So if you have interest in that, that is a great way to vote. I'm going to really encourage people to do early in-person voting. If you prefer to vote by mail, if you need to vote by mail, it's safe, it's secure, but it requires you to be extra vigilant and get that ballot in as early as possible. If you're still holding a mail ballot, I'd say 2 Saturdays before an election, about 10 days before an election, I would go deliver it in a safe and secure drop box or other election location that you can legally drop them off. Or I would say at that point, think about voting in person and as an alternative, because you don't want to leave it up to the U.S. mail and when they might get it. And I'm not talking about the executive order or anything else. It's just the U.S. mail is actually, they're dealing with some budgetary issues and other things. And I think there's going to be some challenges there. So I would say just be extra vigilant, but it works. It works great if that's how you prefer to vote. But if you want to take away even that concern, early in-person voting is really key. So with that, let me just say, I am optimistic like Secretary Simon. I think the more we see the administration get desperate, the more they seem to be scared about what verdict the voters might render on them this November, the more we see that even they acknowledge that they're running out of tools, that they don't have power in this. And I have been so inspired by the election officials like Secretary Simon, his staff, the county and local election officials all throughout the state of Minnesota and everywhere in the country, Republicans and Democrats, who are just getting the job done every single day. There's been more scrutiny on their work than ever before, and yet their work is withstanding that scrutiny every single time. And if you all choose to vote, go out, check your registration. It's really easy to do in Minnesota. Register to vote if you're not already. It's really easy to do in Minnesota. I bet almost all of you are registered to vote. Um, and when you go vote, you're going to find a convenient, safe, joyful experience, really satisfying experience, and go recruit other people who you're not sure are going to vote. Like I said, half of the people in Minnesota, the number is always more than half. As Secretary Simon said, Minnesota is almost always number one in turnout. But find more people. Let's blow away this despair with joy. Let's be excited and celebrate this election in our 250th year. Let's go find people who might otherwise be on the fence about voting and bring them into the process. Let's find people that we might politically disagree with and bring them into the process. Let's do something that shows the world what America is all about. We have all the tools to do that. And again, it's thanks to those public servants who are successfully pushing back against these really dark efforts to interfere in our elections. And so far, they're doing it completely successfully. So I'm very optimistic about how things are going to go. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Peter, and Secretary Simon.
Thanks, Mr. Becker. Thank you so much. Covered a lot of ground there, and we've got lots and lots of questions. And I'll just start throwing them out. I think either of our panelists could jump in as you want to reply. But maybe starting with Secretary Simon here, what kind of information is in the voter data that the federal government is seeking, and what kind of protections do we have in place to prevent them from acquiring it?
Right. I appreciate the question because it gives me an opportunity to really explain this a little bit. So what the federal government is looking for, what the DOJ is looking for, is not just the public information list that we sell routinely to candidates and campaigns and political parties, especially this time of year, right? The public list in Minnesota consists of name, address, year of birth, not date of birth, but year of birth, and voting history. Voting history meaning not who someone votes for. Obviously, no one knows that. We have a secret ballot, but which elections a person votes in. Is this person a one who votes every 4 years for president and that's it? Or do they vote much more frequently at all the elections in between and so forth? That's what's public. But what they want is the so-called unredacted list, which is a fancy word for the stuff that is normally shielded and that is normally private. So they want things, as David Becker said, like Social Security information, driver's license information, and the like. And by the way, when we got that request, that demand really, along with almost every other state and the District of Columbia, the first thing we did was look at the law. We didn't consult our own policy preferences or who we liked or disliked, but what does the law say? And our read of the law is that the Department of Justice is not entitled to this personal sensitive information. And we're not some sort of island of defiance out there. As David already said, I think it's 32 states or 32, including the District of Columbia, that have said no. So a large majority are taking more or less the same legal position that we are. The Department of Justice has sued substantially all of those 32 jurisdictions. And by the way, that's perfectly fine. That's why we have courts, right? Why else do we have courts if not to resolve a difference like this? We think the law says one thing, they think it says another thing, so we go to court. And of course, we'll abide by what the courts say. But that, to the question, is what they want. And that is precisely what we think they're not entitled to under federal law, not to mention state law, which has built up silos and protections around that. So as David said, they're 0-6. 6 states have pushed back on the lawsuit and sought to dismiss it, and 6 of them have been successful. We have such a motion right now. Attorney General Ellison is handling that for our office, and we're waiting on the judge to make her decision right now. So we'll see. Obviously, we'll abide by what the justice system says, but that's the nub of it. It's the Social Security, the driver's license information, and that's what's concerning under the law.
There's a quick follow-up to that. Doesn't the federal government have this information already? What's the problem with handing it over?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I do get that. It's true. The federal government obviously runs the Social Security Administration, and they have it. But that's the issue, right? If that were true and so easy, they would just go down the street and get it from the Social Security Administration, right? Because after all, that's another federal agency. Why don't they just do that? They don't do it because they know they can't do it.
Right.
And instead, they're trying to go around those strictures into the federal government. Yeah, sure, it's in the hands of another federal agency. Notice they aren't knocking on the door of the Social Security Administration. Instead, they're going to the states, and we believe that federal law says no. David, do you want to shed any more light
Yeah,
on
no, no,
that?
I just want to add, I think that's all right. I mean, so first of all, the what the federal government doesn't have is the driver's license numbers. And the
That's
driver's license
yes.
numbers are the primary identifier that is used in voter registrations throughout the country. And what they're trying to do, I think there's two main reasons they're trying to do this. One is they're trying to tell states how to maintain their own voter lists, which federal law doesn't only not permit, it specifically outlaws. It says that the states have the authority to conduct list maintenance, and the federal government doesn't get to tell them you should keep John Doe on the list, but take Jane Doe off the list. I think there's another kind of intent behind this, and that intent might be to kind of just exert federal power over the states and say, give us stuff that you wouldn't ordinarily give us to see if states will capitulate. And unfortunately, about a dozen states did. And with that driver's license number in particular, tied to a social security number, tied to a date of birth, tied to a name, that's going to be very.
Oh, David, I think you're muted just for a second.
Shoot, was I muted the whole time?
No, no, just
Okay.
the last few
That's weird.
words.
I think someone muted me. Maybe I was going on too long. So that the driver's license number and the tied to the social security number and the name and the date of birth are very powerful to allow the federal government to try to dictate to states who stays on the list and who doesn't get on the list. Now, there's nothing in federal law that allows them to do this. And in fact, federal law prevents them from doing this. And time after time after time, now six times, the courts have held that the DOJ can't do this. And of those six judges, I should just say, two of them are Trump appointed judges. So I expect I haven't read anything about the pleadings in Minnesota, but I expect almost all of the states to have a similar experience. So although it's understandable to be worried about the federal government accumulating with very very shady security protocols, sensitive data, I don't think Minnesotans have anything to worry about.
Thanks. Mr. Becker, you alluded to this a little bit, but I wanted to give Secretary Simon a chance to weigh in as well. There's been a number of questions about potential violence or intimidation at the polling place. Is there a role for the Secretary of State's office to protect voting machines, ballots, and polling places from federal agents?
Yeah. Well, I'd say indirectly. I mean, we're not an enforcement agency. We don't have guns. We don't have badges. We don't have subpoena authority. We're not a law enforcement agency. But we stand in that space between jurisdictions that do, counties, cities, obviously the state itself. And so in those instances, while we don't own the equipment that counties and cities do, we would be ready, and the Attorney General would be ready to go to court and seek immediate relief, as would the counties and would the cities as well. So we're in a position to take in those complaints. We have a vigorous and large and active call center in the weeks leading up to the election, and we encourage people, if you see something, say something, call us so that we can get the Attorney General involved, and if need be, seek immediate relief from courts. But no, we don't directly have the authority to literally, sort of stand at the door and force people to do things or not do things. But we can protect the interests of Minnesota voters and work with our partners at the local level to make sure that their law enforcement folks are ready to enforce the law.
Thank you. For either, do you have concerns about the federal government impeding or disrupting the U.S. Postal Service from delivering ballots? There's a handful of questions along those same lines about the Postal Service role in delivering absentee ballots nationwide or in Minnesota.
Go ahead, David.
I mean, I think there's general concerns about the Postal Service putting aside the administration and politics. I mean, Postal Service just testified a few weeks ago that they're dealing with issues. They are trying to restructure. There are delays in how long mail gets to people. All that said, mail ballots go out very early. I don't expect any problems with people receiving their unvoted mail ballot in order to vote that with plenty of time. But when you return a ballot by mail, you are putting some trust in the Postal Service to get it in on time. And fortunately, in states like Minnesota and many, many other states, there's no need to do that because there's so many convenient locations at which you could drop off a ballot. I highly encourage that. If you're someone who prefers to vote by mail or needs to vote by mail, I also, again, I'll just say this. This isn't because mail ballot isn't secure. It isn't because you won't be able to cast a ballot that counts if you choose to vote by mail. But if you want to remove all question from it, early in-person voting is a wonderful way to do it, and I highly encourage you to do it. It energizes me every time I go and vote around my members of my community and see the people who have volunteered to work in my polling places.
Thanks. This question says, even if voting happens without federal interference, what about the inevitable post-election accusations of fraud? I hope they're not
Well,
inevitable, but we have
yeah,
seen.
here's what I would say about that. And Sir, I would say this. The courthouse doors are wide open. They really are at the state and federal level. So it's my job under the Minnesota Constitution to certify, along with a statewide canvassing board, the state election results. But if someone doubts that outcome or thinks we got it wrong, the courthouse doors are wide open. Bring your evidence, bring the testimony, the testifiers, marshal the facts, and that's the place to do it. So, look, no one has to take my word for the outcome of a particular election, but that's why we have these venues, the courts, to appeal. But you got to have evidence. It can't be a vibe or a hunch or a feeling. It's got to be actual evidence. And we've seen this with other elections. So, what I would say to folks who believe that wrong has been done or that there's been fraud or something else that has altered the outcome of an election is, and if you think that those at the county level or at the state level have gotten it wrong or not given it sufficient attention, the avenue is to seek justice in the courts. But I hope we can all agree, once the courts have spoken, once that has all run its course, then we all have the duty to accept the results in the end. So to those who are suspicious or skeptical or even hostile, that's okay. But you got to have facts and you got to have evidence, and the courthouse doors are wide open. David, you anything you want to add?
No, I totally agree. And I think I would go so far as to say I will almost guarantee there will be disinformation spread after the election by losing candidates. It didn't used to be that way in the United States, but sadly we have an economy of grift that has grown around losing candidates, regardless of the outcome. That will happen. But back to the court point that Secretary Simon made. If you have a problem with the rules, I guarantee you Democrats and Republicans don't like all of the rules for elections all over the country. But if you think you have a legal claim against those rules, you can bring them before the election. By election day, those rules are set. And if you can't complain after the election that you didn't like the rules before the election. And if you have a legitimate claim and can bring in evidence about a close election, you can do that through the court process. And I'll just say, Minnesota is the home of probably the most famous recent example of that
Right.
outside of Bush versus Gore in the Coleman versus Franken race in 2008, where you had both sides very well represented by lawyers I know very well, people like Ben Ginsberg on the Republican side, Mark Elias on the Democratic side, trying to bring in evidence about who won in a very, very close election. And when Al Franken was determined to be the winner in the summer of 2009, long after the rest of the Senate had been seated, the parties agreed. It the process had worked out. So when you hear people claiming that there was fraud, when you hear people claiming falsely that the voting machines were hacked or that mail voting was rigged or that non-citizens voted, which we know is not happening in any significant numbers. If you don't believe me, just trust the Trump DHS, which found that in 50 million records, 99.98% of them were documentable citizens that they had in their database, and the other 0.02% A significant number of them were citizens too. They just didn't have the information that the states had. When you hear that, ask yourself first, why aren't you telling it to a court? Because a court's going to make you bring in evidence. A court's not going to listen to you screaming on social media, writing in all caps on social media that an election has been rigged or stolen. Be really distrustful, particularly if it's a candidate you supported who's making those claims, because they're going to try to leverage your sincere disappointment in the election against you, as we've seen so many times among so many good Americans who have been targeted for these lies.
Thank you. We have a question about a feature of Minnesota's election system that's got some attention lately. What about the practice of vouching
Yes.
when people vote? Can you explain that a little bit?
I can explain it, and I can say that there has unfortunately been a lot of misunderstanding is a polite and charitable way, a lot of disinformation about vouching. Just to level set, to register to vote in Minnesota, and I gather most places, it really comes down to two things. You have to show that you are who you say you are, and you live where you say you live. That's it. It doesn't mean 20 things or 8 things or 3 things. Two very simple common sense things. You are who you say you are, that's identity, and you live where you say you live, that is residency. Vouching, which we've had in state law since 1973, supported by Democrats and Republicans over decades. Since 1973, that only pertains to the second piece. The only thing anyone ever vouches for is where someone lives. And it's not just anyone. The person doing the vouching has to live in that would-be voter's precinct. And all of that is logged at the local level. So the person who vouches is logged, and they have to demonstrate that they are who they say they are. And the person who is vouched for is also noted and recorded, etc. Personal story, if you'll permit me. My dad used it a number of years ago. So my parents moved from the house I grew up in and downsized and moved into a condo. And they moved in late September or early October. So by the time that the November election came around, they didn't have a water bill or a utility bill yet in order to demonstrate where they lived. And my dad just had his driver's license reflecting the old address. So vouching is meant precisely for people like my dad. He still had to prove through documents or otherwise that he is who he says he is, the identity part. He is who he says he is, all that stuff. But as to where he lived, he didn't have the papers to show it. So he had literally a next door neighbor come in and vouch for him. It's been extraordinarily effective, extraordinarily secure. And yet today you hear people implying, if not outright saying, what is false, which is that vouching means just any old person off the street can vouch that someone's eligible to vote. That's not true. It's not any old person off the street. It's someone who lives in that precinct, who's swearing an oath and who's documented and who's logged. And the thing they're swearing to is only where that person lives. Only that. They're not swearing that the person's a citizen, that they're 18, anything else, just that. So beware when you hear people saying that vouching is something that it's not. That's all it is. And for 53 years, it's enabled many people, like my dad and countless others, to vote who are eligible to vote.
I just learned something about Minnesota election policy, Steve. Thanks.
Thanks to everyone for your questions. We're at time. If we did not get to your issue, please get in touch with our office. We'd be glad to explain the rules or hope to get your question answered in a sufficient way. Just to end in the spirit of this conversation, someone asks, what can we everyday citizens do to increase our neighbors, friends, and families' confidence in Minnesota elections?
Should I go first and give you the last word?
Go ahead,
Yeah,
please.
I think this is true for not only Minnesotans, but everywhere. I think one of the things that the grifters and disinformation purveyors rely upon is that, unlike Secretary Simon and myself, most people don't think about elections every day. And a lot of elections the policies might seem really esoteric and difficult to understand. And one of the best ways to do that is to volunteer to be a poll worker. to call to contact your county election office and see if they can use you in some way. You'll see all the redundancies and transparencies and checks and balances built into the process. You'll see the trainings. You'll see why people get there early and stay late when they're serving as poll workers. It is really hard to doubt the process once you're a part of it and you see how the process is built to be resilient, not to eliminate human errors. We know human errors exist, but to be resilient against the human errors so we still get to the right result. So please, if you can, volunteer to be a poll worker, encourage others to do that. You'll become an evangelist for our election process, and particularly in Minnesota, which has such a strong election process.
Thank you, David. You stole one of my
Oh,
recommendations.
damn.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Be a poll worker. No, that's good. Be an election judge. It takes 30,000 election judges in Minnesota to run an election every November, every 2 years. That's a lot of people who have to step up and do that job. Remember, it's a job. It's not a volunteer gig. It is very much paid. Even the 2 hours of training is paid. And you can do it as of age 16 in Minnesota, not just 18. If you have a high school student in your life, it might look good on a resume or an application. Think about that. That's one thing. Another thing is to just remind people, as David alluded to, of the transparency in our system. For example, not that people necessarily will want to attend these things, but like if someone is concerned about or skeptical about elections equipment, we have a thing in Minnesota. It's called a public accuracy test, where every jurisdiction in Minnesota, city, township, county that uses elections equipment has to trot that elections equipment out in a publicly noticed meeting before every election. Anyone off the street who lives anywhere can go in and watch that thing. Then after the election's done, we have the reviews that are done, the post-election reviews as part of the canvassing process for counties. Anyone off the street, you don't have to live in that county. If you live in County A and you want to go to County Z, you can do that. Again, I'm not trying to gin up turnout of these things necessarily, because people have lives and jobs and all the rest, but just knowing how transparent it is, knowing all the steps in the process where anyone from the public can come in and watch, take a look under the hood, so to speak. That's another way to engender confidence. And when in doubt, the website is mnvotes.gov, mnvotes.gov.
Thank you so much, Mr. Becker, Secretary Simon, and everyone who attended tonight. We really appreciate you coming to listen and hear what we have to say. As I said before, visit our website, mnvotes.gov, sign up for more, and hear more from our office as we head toward Election Day in 2026. Thank you very much. Good night.
Right.